For most of human existence, survival was measured in movement, in adaptation, in a delicate alignment with forces beyond control. Then, within a relatively brief span of time, that relationship inverted. The human species ceased to drift across landscapes shaped by nature and began, instead, to construct environments shaped by intention. This transformation did not end in the ancient past. It persists, embedded within the structures, systems, and assumptions that define the modern world. What emerged from this shift was not merely agriculture or settlement, but a new logic of existence. Land, once traversed, became divided, claimed, and measured. Time, once guided by seasons and instinct, became structured around cycles of production and obligation. The rhythms of life grew less variable, yet more constrained. Stability introduced predictability, but it also demanded permanence. The cost of leaving increased. The freedom of distance was replaced by the weight of attachment. As populations expanded within fixed spaces, new forms of coordination became necessary. Informal understanding, once sufficient in small groups, could no longer sustain large, dense communities. Systems emerged to manage resources, organize labor, and enforce order. These systems did not remain neutral. They concentrated influence. They established hierarchies. Over time, they evolved into institutions that extended far beyond their original purpose, shaping not only survival, but identity, status, and power. The consequences of this concentration are still visible. Modern societies operate through layers of administration, regulation, and control that mirror early attempts to manage surplus and population density. The same underlying pressures persist: the need to allocate resources, to maintain stability, to coordinate individuals who no longer share direct social bonds. What began as a practical solution to environmental and demographic constraints became the foundation of governance itself. This transformation also redefined the relationship between the individual and the collective. In earlier conditions, autonomy was preserved through mobility. One could leave, detach, and re-establish elsewhere. Within settled systems, departure carried consequences. Access to food, shelter, and security became tied to participation in a structured environment. Over time, dependence on these systems deepened. The individual became integrated into networks that extended beyond immediate control, bound not by proximity alone, but by obligation. At the same time, the capacity to produce and store surplus enabled developments that would have been impossible under earlier conditions. Knowledge could be accumulated and preserved. Specialized roles could emerge. Effort could be redirected from immediate survival toward abstraction, innovation, and cultural expression. The same structures that imposed constraints also created opportunities for complexity. Science, technology, and large-scale cooperation all trace their origins to this capacity for sustained, organized production. Yet this expansion introduced a persistent tension. The systems that allowed for growth also required maintenance. They demanded labor, compliance, and continuity. They reduced uncertainty in some areas while amplifying vulnerability in others. Dense populations facilitated exchange and progress, but also enabled the rapid spread of disease. Concentrated resources allowed for development, but also created targets for conflict. Security and risk became intertwined, each reinforcing the other. As these patterns extended across regions and generations, they converged into a shared trajectory. Different environments produced variations in form, but the underlying structure remained consistent. Surplus led to growth. Growth required coordination. Coordination produced hierarchy. Hierarchy concentrated power. This sequence, once initiated, proved difficult to reverse. Each stage reinforced the next, creating systems that expanded in scale and complexity over time. The modern world reflects the culmination of this process. Cities, states, and global networks operate on principles established thousands of years ago. the management of resources, the organization of labor, the existence of centralized authority. These are not recent inventions, but continuations of an ancient pattern. Even the concept of progress itself is rooted in the assumption that the environment can be reshaped, optimized, and controlled. At its peak, this transformation reaches a kind of paradox. Humanity gained the ability to alter landscapes, influence climates, and connect distant regions into unified systems. At the same time, it became increasingly dependent on those very systems. The structures designed to provide stability now define the limits within which life unfolds. To step outside them is no longer a simple act of movement, but a disruption of the conditions that sustain existence. The legacy of this shift is not singular. It is a balance of gains and constraints, of expansion and limitation. The world that exists today, dense, interconnected, and highly structured, is not an inevitable outcome, but the result of a series of adaptations to specific pressures. Understanding this origin reveals something fundamental. The systems that shape modern life are neither fixed nor absolute. They were constructed, layer by layer, in response to changing conditions. And within that realization lies a subtle implication. If the structures of civilization were formed through necessity, then they carry within them the logic of those necessities. They reflect the choices made under pressure, the trade-offs accepted for survival and growth. To examine them is not only to look backward, but to recognize the forces that continue to guide the present. Civilization did not conclude with its rise. It remains an ongoing process, still shaped by the same fundamental dynamics that first brought it into being. For tens of thousands of years, the human species had existed in a state of constant motion, attuned to the rhythms of the earth, the migrations of animals, and the seasonal availability of plants. Life was dictated not by permanence, but by responsiveness. Mobility ensured survival, and adaptation dictated the limits of habitation. Then, around 12,000 years ago, a subtle but profound shift began to unfold. The planet entered a new epoch, one of relative warmth and environmental stability that would come to be known as the Holocene. Glacial ice, which had dominated vast expanses of the northern hemisphere, began to recede, releasing waters that transformed landscapes and opened corridors previously inhospitable to sustained human activity. Regions that had once been locked under ice sheets or scorched by volatile climates now presented opportunities for life to flourish in ways that had been impossible before. Within these newly hospitable zones, particularly in the Fertile Crescent, the interplay of topography, water, and soil created a unique abundance. Valleys and river plains became conduits of fertility, naturally concentrating wild grains, pulses, and edible plants in dense, predictable clusters. Gazelle herds and other game animals followed these corridors, moving predictably across the terrain. For mobile foragers, the sudden reliability of these resources presented a radical departure from the uncertainty that had previously defined existence. The energy gained from foraging began to surpass the energy expended in the pursuit of sustenance, and the calculus of survival shifted. Where once humans had relied on mobility as their primary strategy, they now faced an environment where staying put promised continuity and a relative reduction in risk. This environmental abundance was amplified by climatic stability. Temperature fluctuations became less extreme, rainfall patterns more consistent, and seasonal cycles more predictable. The harsh oscillations of the late Pleistocene, marked by sudden glacial advances and retreats, gave way to prolonged periods in which plants could germinate and mature with a reliable rhythm. Rivers swelled predictably in spring, replenishing soils with fertile silt, while summers, though still challenging, no longer imposed catastrophic droughts or forced rapid migration. For communities living at the margins of survival, these conditions presented a tangible opportunity, the potential to establish permanent structures, to accumulate materials, and to begin exerting a measure of control over the immediate environment. As these pressures and opportunities converged, a cultural response emerged. Human groups began experimenting with semi-permanent dwellings, constructing stone foundations and storage pits to hold the seasonal bounty. Sedentism was not simply a matter of preference. It was a rational adaptation to the landscape's newfound predictability. The secure availability of resources allowed these communities to invest labor into infrastructure that would have been unsustainable in a mobile existence. Circular stone homes, grinding stones, and storage facilities appeared, tangible markers of a deliberate choice to anchor life in place. In these settlements, knowledge of plant cycles, animal behavior, and local ecology could be accumulated and transmitted with greater fidelity, enhancing both survival and social cohesion. Yet the environmental promise was coupled with new challenges. Concentrated populations placed pressure on local ecosystems, consuming wild grains and game at rates that demanded careful management. Seasonal abundance could no longer be taken for granted. Communities that remained in one location began to manipulate their surroundings, selecting seeds, clearing competing vegetation, and creating rudimentary irrigation channels. The human species was, for the first time, actively reshaping ecological patterns, not merely responding to them. This intervention was cautious and experimental, reflecting a deepening understanding of cause and effect within the natural world. The climatic context also magnified demographic possibilities. In mobile bands, the spacing of births was naturally limited by the demands of mobility and the care of infants. Within sedentary settlements, however, these constraints relaxed. Women could bear children more frequently, and populations began to expand. The stability provided by consistent food sources allowed for larger social units, which in turn necessitated greater organization. Environmental and climatic shifts had set in motion a feedback loop. Predictable resources enabled permanence. Permanence allowed population growth, and growing populations intensified the management of both resources and social structures. By the time communities had fully grasped the implications of these changes, the world itself had begun to bend to human needs. River valleys and fertile plains were no longer mere conduits for movement. They were stages upon which complex societies could emerge. Environmental stability provided the foundation, and human ingenuity began to construct upon it. The climatic shifts of the Holocene were not simply background conditions. They were the catalysts that transformed survival strategies, encouraging the species to experiment with permanence, to accumulate knowledge, and to forge the earliest expressions of civilization. This period demonstrates the inextricable link between ecology and culture. Human beings did not settle because of ambition alone, nor did they abandon mobility purely for convenience. The natural world had realigned in ways that made permanence both feasible and advantageous. It is within this convergence of climatic reliability, ecological abundance, and adaptive experimentation that the foundations of human settlement were laid. The environmental and climatic forces that shaped these decisions resonate still, for they established the conditions under which society could grow, knowledge could accumulate, and the species could embark on the trajectory that would ultimately define the contours of the modern world. Sedentism, born of these environmental transformations, represents more than a logistical adaptation. It is the first step in a profound reorientation of human existence. The human species moved from responding to external conditions to shaping them, from tracking the rhythms of nature to organizing life around them. In the temperate valleys and fertile plains of the Holocene, the blueprint for civilization began to emerge not through conquest, but through the subtle guidance of climate, the promise of abundance, and the disciplined choice to remain, to build, and to endure. The echoes of these decisions reverberate across millennia, establishing patterns that continue to influence human settlement, societal organization, and the complex interactions between humanity and the environment even today. The shift from a life defined by constant movement to one anchored in permanence marked one of the most profound transformations in human history. reshaping not only survival strategies, but the very fabric of society. For tens of millennia, human communities had navigated a world of unpredictability, their populations constrained by the rhythms of migration, the availability of wild game, and the seasonal cycles of plants. Life in motion demanded small, flexible groups, adaptive leadership, and minimal accumulation of material possessions, for any excess could hinder mobility and slow survival. Yet, as environmental stability increased and certain regions offered reliable resources, the calculus of human existence began to change. Permanence became not only feasible but advantageous, allowing communities to establish dwellings, cultivate edible plants, and store surplus food, thereby reducing vulnerability to seasonal scarcity. With sedentism came a profound demographic shift, where previously the spacing of births had been influenced by the demands of mobility and the burdens of infant care. Permanent settlements permitted denser, more continuous population growth. Children could be raised with greater security, and the human lifespan, already extending through incremental improvements in diet and safety, began to exert an influence on social dynamics. Communities swelled beyond the sizes sustainable in a mobile existence, requiring new mechanisms for cooperation, conflict resolution, and resource distribution. The seeds of complex social hierarchies, once unnecessary in small, itinerant groups, began to appear as labor specialization, leadership roles, and communal responsibilities were instituted to maintain the stability and productivity of these larger populations. The architecture of life itself adapted to these new conditions. Permanent dwellings provided more than shelter. They were centers of knowledge transmission and social cohesion. Storage facilities allowed for the accumulation of surplus grains, which in turn enabled the division of labor, as not every individual needed to be directly involved in food acquisition. Certain members of the community could experiment with new technologies, tools, and agricultural methods, while others focused on maintaining social networks or crafting essential implements. This reallocation of human effort catalyzed innovation and created the first discernible distinctions in societal roles. The human species, previously defined by collective adaptability, now began to construct differentiated roles and hierarchies, establishing patterns of organization that would reverberate through the subsequent millennia. Social networks expanded beyond immediate kinship as settlements grew, incorporating broader alliances and cooperative mechanisms. The predictable surplus of resources allowed communities to support individuals who specialized in roles other than food procurement, such as toolmakers, ritual leaders, and early record keepers. This diversification created interdependencies, with each member's contribution directly affecting communal survival, embedding a new layer of complexity into social relations. Conflict, negotiation, and cooperation became increasingly codified, driven by the pressures of coexisting in denser populations and the necessity of managing shared resources. The foundations of governance and proto-institutional structures emerged, reflecting the interplay between environmental opportunity and human ingenuity. Cultural and symbolic life also flourished under these conditions. Sedentary populations could invest in long-term projects, including ceremonial spaces, artistic expression, and the beginnings of written or pictographic communication. These practices reinforced social cohesion and transmitted knowledge across generations, further stabilizing the population and embedding a collective identity tied not just to immediate survival, but to shared experience and memory. By anchoring themselves to specific landscapes, humans were able to observe, manipulate, and interpret the natural world in ways that mobile existence had not permitted, deepening understanding of ecological patterns and seasonal cycles, which in turn informed more sophisticated agricultural strategies. The transition to sedentary life was not without tension or adaptation. Concentrated populations placed increased pressure on local resources, demanding careful management and the emergence of rules, rituals, and practices designed to mitigate scarcity and conflict. Communities learned to coordinate labor for irrigation, crop rotation, and seasonal harvesting, integrating ecological knowledge into social norms. Leadership structures evolved, sometimes informal, sometimes more centralized, to mediate disputes, allocate resources, and orchestrate collective action. This integration of environmental awareness with social coordination set the stage for the rise of organized society, reflecting a delicate balance between human agency and the constraints of the surrounding world. Ultimately, the move from mobility to permanence reshaped human existence at every level. Population densities increased, social hierarchies emerged, labor became specialized, and communities developed unprecedented complexity in their internal organization. Life anchored to specific geographies allowed humans to manipulate their environment with intent and foresight, generating surpluses that reinforced social structures and enabled innovation. The human species, once defined by its responsiveness to chance and mobility, had begun to define itself through permanence, accumulation, and social interdependence. This transition was not merely a change in residence. It was a recalibration of the human experience, establishing the demographic and organizational frameworks that would underpin the earliest civilizations and leave an indelible imprint on the trajectory of human society. By settling in place, humanity discovered a new rhythm, one measured not by migration, but by cultivation, cooperation, and strategic foresight. Populations expanded, knowledge accumulated, and the first complex networks of social and economic interaction were formed. The shift from mobility to sedentary life, driven by environmental opportunity and human ingenuity, became the crucible in which the earliest seeds of civilization were forged, transforming the human species from wanderers of the land into architects of enduring social landscapes, capable of reshaping the world around them with deliberate and sustained effort. The emergence of agriculture represented one of the most consequential adaptations in human history, a deliberate response to pressures both environmental and social that demanded a new approach to sustenance. For millennia, humans had relied on hunting and foraging, strategies intimately tied to seasonal abundance and the unpredictability of wild resources. Yet as population densities increased and familiar landscapes grew subject to ecological stress, reliance on chance harvests became increasingly untenable. Communities confronted with the dual challenges of supporting larger populations and mitigating risk began to experiment with the cultivation of plants and the controlled breeding of animals, seeking to impose order upon the natural cycles that had long governed survival. What began as tentative interventions, scattering seeds near settlements, encouraging the growth of particularly productive plants, taming local fauna rapidly evolved into systematic practices, reflecting both observational acumen and a willingness to reshape the environment to meet human needs. The progression from incidental cultivation to fully organized agricultural systems was gradual but inexorable. Early experiments required careful attention to soil, water, and seasonal rhythms, fostering an intimate knowledge of local ecologies that would prove essential to sustain success. Communities discovered that, by manipulating the land, they could produce reliable surpluses, fundamentally altering the relationship between effort and reward. This surplus, in turn, allowed for specialization of labor. Not every individual needed to gather or hunt. Certain members could focus on tool-making, constructing storage facilities, or refining agricultural techniques, while others maintained social cohesion and managed emergent hierarchies. The cultivation of crops and the domestication of animals became intertwined with social and economic organization, creating feedback loops in which agricultural innovation and societal complexity reinforced one another. Agriculture also imposed new rhythms on human life, anchoring daily activity to the cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting. The predictability of cultivated resources encouraged settlement in specific locales, while the storage of surplus transformed not only diet but social structures. Those who controlled access to food could exert influence, laying the groundwork for emerging leadership roles and early forms of governance. Disputes over land, water, and resources required negotiation, often mediated through emerging cultural norms and ritual practices. In this way, agriculture catalyzed a profound restructuring of human interaction. Cooperation, competition, and coordination became central to survival, replacing the ad hoc improvisation characteristic of hunter-gatherer bands. The transformative power of agriculture extended beyond population and social structures to cognition and knowledge. Communities engaged in deliberate cultivation had to observe, record, and predict environmental patterns, fostering advanced understanding of seasons, weather, and plant biology. Knowledge became cumulative and transferable, with lessons learned across generations informing more sophisticated planting methods, crop rotations, and animal husbandry techniques. This accumulation of expertise not only enhanced efficiency, but allowed humans to exert unprecedented control over their environment, turning landscapes into managed systems designed to optimize yield and reliability. The human species, once reactive to ecological conditions, began to proactively shape ecosystems to suit its needs, laying the foundation for technological and social innovations that would define future civilizations. The consequences of this transformation were felt in daily life, population structure, and cultural expression. Dietary consistency improved, reducing the unpredictability of caloric intake, while denser populations facilitated the growth of communities large enough to sustain artisans, scribes, and religious leaders. Agricultural settlements became centers of experimentation and cultural transmission, fostering innovations in toolmaking, architecture, and eventually symbolic communication. Social stratification, once minimal in nomadic bands, became increasingly apparent as surplus resources allowed certain individuals to accumulate wealth, influence, and authority. Hierarchical structures emerged not arbitrarily, but as practical solutions to the logistical challenges of organizing large, sedentary populations dependent on coordinated agricultural production. Yet the transition to agriculture was neither simple nor uniform. It demanded adaptation to localized ecological conditions and constant recalibration in response to failures, pestilence, and climate variability. Communities learned to balance risk and reward, integrating storage strategies, crop diversity, and cooperative labor to sustain themselves over time. This iterative process fostered resilience and innovation, creating feedback loops in which success encouraged further experimentation and refinement. The human species, through trial, observation, and adaptation, was no longer merely exploiting its environment, it was engineering it, establishing systems that would sustain increasingly complex social networks and permit the emergence of cities, trade, and eventually states. Ultimately, agriculture reshaped humanity at every scale: the individual, the family, the community, and the broader social system. By converting wild abundance into predictable, controlled production, humans unlocked the potential for population growth, social differentiation, and technological advancement. The pressures that had initially prompted this radical adaptation became the catalysts for enduring transformation, illustrating the profound interplay between environmental constraints and human ingenuity. Agriculture did not merely provide food. It redefined the parameters of human existence, establishing the conditions under which societies could expand, knowledge could accumulate, and the earliest civilizations could arise. In this way, the adoption of cultivation and animal husbandry stands as a pivotal inflection point, demonstrating how a species capable of observation, planning, and cooperation could fundamentally restructure both its social and ecological worlds, forging the path to the complex civilizations that define the modern era. The formation of early cities marked a decisive juncture in the trajectory of human civilization, a point at which communities transcended the bounds of kinship and subsistence to forge spatial and social complexity on an unprecedented scale. As agricultural surpluses stabilized food supply, settlements expanded from clustered villages into dense, interconnected urban centers, each a microcosm of human ingenuity and ambition. Streets, marketplaces, and storage facilities began to define the physical landscape, reflecting not only practical necessity, but also emergent social order. The concentration of people in fixed locales necessitated the development of rules, norms, and mechanisms of coordination. Spontaneous cooperation that had sufficed in small bands could no longer sustain larger populations. Within these burgeoning cities, hierarchies naturally arose, initially pragmatic in their origin, with individuals assuming roles based on skill, knowledge, or access to essential resources. Leadership and authority became institutionalized, codifying responsibilities and mediating disputes, while specialized professions, artisans, traders, religious functionaries began to differentiate the human experience along lines of occupation and status. The progression from simple organization to structured hierarchy unfolded with remarkable consistency across early urban centers. As settlements accumulated, wealth and population density intensified. Governance structures became increasingly formalized, often embodied in councils, priesthoods, or chieftainships that regulated trade, taxation, and labor distribution. Monumental architecture and communal projects, granaries, irrigation systems, defensive walls served dual purposes, ensuring survival and reinforcing social cohesion through shared endeavor and visible expressions of authority. These physical manifestations of hierarchy mirrored an emergent ideology that linked social stratification to divine sanction, ancestral lineage or merit, embedding power within both tangible infrastructure and cultural narrative. The result was a city that functioned as a carefully balanced system, integrating production, administration, and symbolic authority into a coherent framework capable of sustaining large populations over time. Climactic in this transformation was the emergence of codified laws and bureaucratic apparatus, tools that allowed cities to navigate the complexities of scale. Agreements, punishments, and records of transactions ensured predictability in human interactions, reducing conflict and facilitating the exchange of goods, services, and knowledge. Writing, initially developed to track agricultural output and commerce, became both a technical necessity and a medium for cultural transmission, encoding rules, rituals, and collective memory. Through these systems, urban centers achieved a remarkable degree of stability, enabling experimentation, specialization, and accumulation of expertise that would have been impossible in dispersed, mobile communities. Hierarchy was not merely imposed. It was continuously reinforced through visible symbols of power, spatial organization, and ritualized social interaction, creating a self-perpetuating network of authority, obligation, and cooperation. The social implications of these early urban structures extended far beyond governance. Concentrated populations created opportunities for collaboration across disciplines, catalyzing innovation in metallurgy, ceramics, textiles, and agriculture, while simultaneously providing the conditions for social tension, competition, and negotiation. Individuals learned to navigate networks of dependency and influence, balancing personal ambition with communal survival. Families, clans, and guilds became interwoven with civic institutions, producing complex matrices of loyalty, responsibility, and opportunity. Education and apprenticeship began to formalize knowledge transfer, ensuring that skills, religious practices, and cultural traditions could persist across generations. The city, in essence, became an engine of both social stratification and collective advancement, a crucible in which the human species refined mechanisms of organization, coordination, and governance. By integrating space, labor, and authority, early cities laid the foundational architecture of organized civilization. The interplay between physical infrastructure, hierarchical oversight, and social roles created a template that could accommodate growth, manage conflict, and harness human potential in ways that smaller communities could not. The consolidation of leadership, the codification of laws, and the emergence of specialized professions collectively forged a society in which survival, productivity, and cultural continuity were systematically secured. These innovations were not merely functional. They embodied a profound reconception of what it meant to be human in a densely populated environment, linking individual endeavor to collective purpose. Urban centers, through their very design and social organization, transformed human experience from episodic and precarious subsistence into structured, predictable, and progressively complex existence. Ultimately, the early city was more than a settlement. It was a manifestation of human ingenuity and social foresight, an experimental stage for the principles of organized civilization that continue to shape the modern world. Hierarchical structures enabled the coordination necessary for monumental achievements, while simultaneously producing the conditions for cultural and technological innovation. As populations grew, as commerce and communication expanded, and as rituals and laws solidified, these urban centers demonstrated that the human species could engineer systems capable of sustaining complexity across time and space. The legacy of these first cities is not confined to archaeology. It resonates through every structured society that followed, offering a profound testament to humanity's capacity to impose order, create opportunity, and redefine the parameters of collective existence.